windy night, and just press that, thank you. First of all, apologies from Elizabeth, who was unavailable tonight for the best of family reasons, but she does send her apologies. It seems a long time ago, October, when we had our first winter programme meeting with the AGM and everyone's photographs. And then all of a sudden we're here at the final lecture for the series. So without further ado, I'll ask Mary, please, to tell us about our first field trip and to introduce Ron.
Our first field trip will be on Thursday, the 24th of March. So that's coming up soon. We're going to meet in Muirvord at 10 o'clock. I went last week to the Lily Loch just to have a look around, and I discovered that the walkways are completely flooded just now, so the water level's too high. So I think we might be wise to change our plans, although we'll still meet at Muirvord. We'll maybe share transport and go down to the shore at North Keswick, not North Keswick, at Redcastle, the Redcastle end. And we're going to be looking at plants vegetatively, and we're going to be using the vegetative key. Can you see that? The book?
Yep.
If you've got this book, please can you bring it along? And the plan is that whatever the weather, it won't matter. We'll gather some vegetative parts of plants, and then we'll go back to the hub at Muirvord, where Elizabeth's kindly booked a room for us. And if the weather's awful, we'll just enjoy being in the shelter there, and we can get a cuppa and we can use the keys and get familiar with the book. And it doesn't matter that the plants won't be in flower, we'll be able to identify them just using vegetative characteristics. So it'll be good practice, and it should be good fun, and we'll be able to get, as I say, a warm hot cup of tea, cup of coffee at the same time. So that should be great. But Audrey will send around the details, so just have a look at them carefully just to make sure that the venue or nothing changes, so that we know what the plans are. So that'd be great if you can send them round shortly, Audrey. However, tonight I'd like just to briefly introduce our speaker, who is Ron Summers, and he's going to talk to us about Abernethy Forest. And it's just been wonderful seeing those stunning photos. Ron has worked for many years as a conservation scientist with the RSPB, studying the birds of the pine woods at Abernethy, and he's also interested in the development of woodland structure in native pine woods. So we're delighted to have Ron with us this evening, and I'm going to hand over to him so we can learn about Abernethy pine forest. So thank you, Ron. I will just mute myself, that would be great.
Thank you very much, Mary, for the introduction. So let's see if I can get this going now. Okay, I'm going to talk about the history as well as the ecology of the forest. It's quite interesting to look at history, especially of forests, because they develop so slowly. So if you want to manage a site, you kind of have to know what's gone before and what the processes are at developing a forest, so you can make the appropriate management decisions about where you want to go over time. So as Mary said, I work for the RSPB in the Conservation Science Department. Only just, I shall be retiring next month, so this will be my last RSPB talk. Okay, here's a photograph of the upper part of the forest. And the RSPB's had this reserve now for quite a number of years. So it encompasses mountains, moorlands, and forest, which is what I'm going to talk about today. So one of the key things of interest about the forest is it has more of what's classed as Caledonian pinewood than any other site in Scotland. So there's quite a lot riding on ensuring the conservation status of the Caledonian forest here. So the RSPB started to buy parts of this from 1975, and various chunks have been bought over the years. So they now own quite a lot of the forest. There's still the Dell Woods, which is under the control of Scott Nature. So a good starting point for understanding Caledonian pine woods is this book, Stephen Carlyle. I'm sure a lot of you know about this. It's actually got a slightly inappropriate title because native pine woods can also refer to plantations. So there's quite a bit of confusion when people are talking about native pine woods. So if a woodland is as a native species and occurs as a wood, it could be classed as a native pine wood. So that could be a Scots pine plantation, as I said, but also Caledonian pine woods. So I'm going to stick with Caledonian pine woods too, so I'm not ambiguous over the terms. So here are some of the famous quotes from this book. So they called the native pine woods as lineal descendants from post-glacial times on these sites. In other words, there's been pines on these sites ever since they established after the glaciers retreated. And these have regenerated naturally from ancestors of like origin. So there's purely natural processes that have allowed the forest to develop over time, over the last approximately 9,000 years, to see what, and we have now the legacy of that. And the bottom one, to stand them in them is feel the past, is this emotive phrase that they wrote. So there's many differences between what we class as Caledonian pine woods and plantations. Firstly, most obvious is the species. So it's virtually all Scots pine trees in Caledonian pine. There's also broadleaf trees of different species. But plantations of conifers are various species, quite a lot of North American species. You notice too the spacing is different, although that's a very extreme case on the right. The spacing is much denser in a plantation for obvious reasons. The forester wants the timber to all be in the stem. Whereas Caledonian pine woods have got these big lateral branches, which are no use to a forester. By being open grown, we have a shrub layer, nice shrub layer in Caledonian pine woods, whereas you're lucky to put a moss layer in a plantation, especially if it's Sitka spruce. There's another major difference is the age of the trees. So you see this dead tree on the left in the Caledonian pine wood, that's several hundred years old probably. So it's not easy to date dead trees. Can be done, but it's not easy. Nevertheless, there are trees up to about 400 years old in Caledonian pine woods in Scotland. And they result in large dead trees, which are important for wildlife. Whereas in plantations, they're harvested with usually between 50 and 100 years, depending on the species, to maximize timber production. So the left map is drawn from McVeigh and Ratcliffe. The green area is what they reckoned the Caledonian pine would be distributed if it hadn't been lost as we've lost it. The red dots are the current sites. So you can see in Strathspey, Deeside, and quite a lot on the west. The map on the right is a true representation of the area of the different Caledonian pine woods. So you can see there in Strathspey we have the pointer there. So there's Abernethy and Rothiemurchus, Ballachbuie, Glentana. And you can see the West Coast ones are largely very small. To give you a impression of the sizes of what this resource is, the dark green here is Caledonian pine wood. So that represents about 1% of the woodland in Scotland. You see the majority are non-native, primarily Sitka spruce, and also lodgepole pine and larch. So just to hammer home how small the colouring pine woods are, they could all be put into a square of 13 kilometres by 13 kilometres. We know it had a wider distribution in the past because you can find these stumps of pines in peat bogs which have been exposed. And of course, carbon dating tells you they are thousands of years old. The other way you can look at through time where these pine woods have been, this is an example from Abernethy Forest where there's a core being taken through the bog at this Loch Grey. And it shows you the proportion of pollen grains over time. So 0 here is the present day, and it goes back to where trees start to establish after the glaciers left. So birch came in earlier and then has maintained a presence throughout the Holocene. Pines came in round about 8.5 to 9,000 years ago. And you can see the pines have been present throughout that time on this site. Alder came in later and heather much later as the forest was opened out, it seems, and allowed more light into the forest and the development of heather. We could also learn about the history of the pines and forest by looking at trees that have fallen into lochs. So this is not my work, it's done by Rob Wilson from St Andrews University. But these trees that fall into the lochs in the very cold conditions, they hardly rot down at all. And Rob has dated some trees from Loch and Elan that are 8,000 years old. So virtually some of the first pines that established after the glaciation left are still there. Guy in the middle is Rob Wilson with his co-workers. You can see they're dragging a log out of this loch, which is now, the area around is devoid of trees, but in the past, clearly there were trees. And you can see there's the edge of the forest there in the background. This is the upper parts of Abernethy Forest, or non-forest if you like. So once you drag a log out, you can section it and look at ring widths. The gaps between the rings gives an indication of the growing conditions at the time. So Rob is very interested in looking at the past climate, which has affected the forest over the Holocene. And because these ring widths is effectively a barcode, you can match that barcode with other trees and you can work through time to develop a chronology over the Holocene. So that you can say, you can take a log, look at the barcode and say, well, that grew in 1296 or whatever. So he's now developed back 1,000 years. And he's got snapshots of logs from different times, which is carbon dated. And his goal in the time is to fill in these gaps so that you've got a complete chronology for pines in Strathspey. The other interesting thing about this log you can see is that the cambium stopped growing at this time, and we suspect that was due to a fire. It scarred this part of the tree, and the living part then grew round over the damaged part. So that fire could be dated. One of the interesting things is, why did some of these forests actually survive? So much was lost, and yet we have these wee scraps. This is in Inverness. You've probably seen the statue. James IV, he was very keen on hunting. And that seems to be one of the reasons how these forests survived through the medieval time, because they're used as hunting sites. He was very keen on falconry, apparently, but not pizza. This is the first idea of a map, which was a sketch really, and it dates back to the 1500s. So not long after James IV was using this site as a hunting area. Abernethy Forest is denoted either side of this river. This is the River Nethy, and these symbols there represent the forest. So though they look like what we call the broadleaf trees, because it says fir woods here, we know this refers to pines. This is the old name for pines. Clearly there was some discussion about where this entered the Spey. This is the Spey running from in this direction here. But the other thing is clear is that this is a farmed landscape. So these names here like Tullach and Rymore and Rhynerig, these are names that we know today. There's Cool Mikhail as well, which is you know about. And down here we have Abernethy Church, symbol of church, and Abernethy Castle. This is the very first of what we'd class as a map, the William Roy maps. This was made just after the Jacobite Rebellion, the last one, done by the Hanoverian army for strategic reasons. So here you can see, this is Abernethy Forest here. This is Loch Garten here, and that's Loch na Cruach. I'll mention both these lochs again, so it gives you an idea of space. And there's various hills that we know the names of as well. There's the River Nethy winding through. This is quite an interesting map because it's prior to the first large-scale planting, which then became prominent over time, more recently. This is the first guy who embarked on large-scale planting, the good Sir James. So he did a lot of improvements on his estate, and he was very keen and also, as well as planting, he was keen on exploiting Abernethy. In these days, it was difficult to get the timber out, but this is what they did. So in the forest, there's a number of dams which were built across streams. This was a big dam on the Alp Clashnecht. And what happened was there'd be a sluice here, and water would pond up behind here. And when they wanted a rush of water, they'd open a sluice, and that would help to float logs down the streams and down the Spey. So at the mouth of the Spey, there were boatyards which could make use of this timber. So that last photograph was taken there, looking across the dam. That gives the extent of the pond that developed. This is a lade here which runs from the River Nethy, running to also help to fill this dam. And then they would flush the logs down the Nethy like that. The other thing you can see in this old map is the farm of Inchtomach here. And here they had, on pretty good land, they had crops. So not only was timber being exploited from the forest, but there was farmers in the forest, basically subsistence farmers. And of course, in the upper parts of Abernethy, there were sheilings for the summertime. Wrong way. Now, the guy who made the first lease of the area for hunting had a sister called Anne. So he was a rich industrialist from the south who decided he liked hunting, and he leased Abernethy. Meanwhile, while he shot grouse and deer and what else, Anne made these amazing paintings. And you can see in the river here, the Nethy here, We have the logs that have been cut for floating, ready to float down the river. And that mountain there is recognisable as Bynack Moor. Now here's photography starting to make itself felt. So we now have photographs of the logging. This is probably one of the last floats. And you can see the size of the timber is very similar to the paintings in it by Anne Holt. And this is down the River Drewey, which comes out of, past Inver of course. And the guys there have got these long poles with hooks on them. That helps to guide these logs down the river. So once we got to the Spey, sometimes they would make these into rafts, so that a raft would go down the Spey to the shipyards at the mouth of the Spey. Wars were not a good thing for forests. So here you can see, this is John Thompson's atlas after the Napoleonic War. There's Loch, oh dear, wrong way. Loch Garten here, and there's Loch Recruach here. So in the Roy map, that whole area was forested, and it seems to have been lost. The only major part which was not felled was this area here on the southeast end. And I'll show this later on in the talk. But the first Ordnance Survey map was made not long after this, and it shows that this whole area was wooded again. So clearly there was a lot of either natural recovery, also planting, which led to the forest again being over this area. The orange parts are bogs, by the way. Green is wood, of course, and blue is lochs. These are actually floating dams. That's a floating dam. There's the floating dam. Oh yeah, floating dams. There they are. As I said, there were farmers also living in the forest. And another painting we have showing what was happening with the forest. And there's the small farm of Lynn McGilbert in the foreground. Interestingly, there's no cropping around this. We know from the census that was carried out around the time that people living there were not farmers, but rather weavers. So that kind of accounts for the lack of cropping. But you do get an indication of the forest extending up into Cairngorms. And there's Bynack Moor again. That was in the Anne Holt's painting. That's Cairngorm. So that's Abernethy up in there. One of the things the farmers weren't actually allowed to fell timber. They burnt peat to keep themselves warm. There was no felling of timber for firewood. The laird was keen on making sure that the pines were for him for sale and export. But what they did do was the farmers knew that if a tree was scarred with fire, and you can see this area in the foreground here has all been exposed. So that when the cambium dies and sheds the bark, what happens is that the wood behind fills up with resin. This is the tree's defense mechanism for infection. And the farmers knew, the folk knew that this resin-filled wood burnt well, and they used to cut chunks of it to make these things called fir candles. This tree is almost 400 years old, by the way. You probably know Stuart Taylor, but he and I were quite interested in this fir candle story. So we made some. This is one burning here next to a normal wax candle. You can see it's quite a fierce flame, and the little spurts here of this is pockets of resin just going into flames. And you see that he's got two running there, which are give enough light to read a book by and also take a photograph. They burned very quickly, unfortunately, and they also gave up a lot of smoke. So I think Janet was probably not too chuffed with Stuart burning these in the house. As I said, as the railways opened up, a lot of people were quite interested in hunting. So these lodges were built in the Highlands so that they can come up in August and shoot grouse and whatever. And that happened in Abernethy as well. This is Forest Lodge, which is the largest wooden building in Scotland, we believe. And over time, there's newer photographs which indicate how this woodland has expanded and developed over time. Anyway, they would come up here to shoot grouse and lots of other things as well. So I managed to get hold of the game books from the past owners. So we get an idea of the numbers that they were shooting. And you can see that there's a peak there of over 4,000 red grouse, but generally, a few hundred, and it's dwindled down to a few hundred nowadays. Black grouse was shot in big numbers, especially before the Second World War. And then it was all stopped through 1980. You can see here that there was no capercaillies being shot, even though we were shooting lots of black grouse, no capercaillie were being shot. I think this is because the capercaillie became extinct in the 1870s, I reckon, and they were reintroduced back in Scotland successfully sorry, I got this wrong. They became extinct in the 1780s, and then reintroduced in the 1830s in Taymouth, in Perthshire. And gradually the population spread up and down the glens. And I think what happened was that they only reached Abernethy around about 1910, 20. And then they became part of the game to be shot. And again, as with black grouse, you probably know the capercaillies numbers are really low now, and there's no more hunting since the 1980s. That's the last shot. Exploitation for timber has continued right through till the 1980s. You can see here, this is the permanent setup, mainly making fence posts and pallets was what they were doing. But they also had these mobile sawmills which could go to different parts of the forest to exploit. And then really just towards the end of the planting and felling phase, the ploughing was carried out. This is in the North Abernethy, which is very wet. So you can see these are water-filled channels, and also through the dry moraines, they ploughed. One of the decisions made by Stuart Taylor when he was in charge of Abernethy Forest was to remove plantations if they were in the main area for the Caledonian pinewood. So this is Caledonian pinewood behind the plough lines. But you can clearly see that after about 30, 40 years, these plough lines are still visible. All the trees were removed that were in lines. What's left is some odd trees which he reckoned were self-seeded. It shows you the extent of the effective ploughing over time. So this is the legacy of what RSPB was left with when it was bought over time. Now this is the section that I showed you had survived the Napoleonic War fellings. It also survived the First World War and Second World War fellings, which occurred mainly in this northern part of Abernethy. But these dates there on the purple parts are all referred to 20th century planting. So it's 1958 was that 58. And a lot of planting in the 70s here and 60s. And these are the first plantings that were done in the southern part of the forest, which were the most up until then were kind of pristine in terms of what Stephen Carlyle regarded as Caledonian pinewoods. The yellow bits refer to years when there was clear felling of Caledonian pinewood. So 82 there on the northern slopes of this hill. And this one here close to Nethy Bridge in 84. So that was the one where there was a big stooshy over why that was happening. And there was such a public outrage that that was stopped. So despite the fact that the forest has been knocked around a bit over time, we still have quite extensive biodiversity. There's, the last count was about 3,500 different species of plants and animals and fungi. Really, if I wanted to talk about the wildlife of Abernethy, I should only be talking about fungi. Yeah, fungi and beetles maybe. You know, these overwhelm the biodiversity of Abernethy more than anything else. And there's a picture of a fungus as well. The top is what's known as tiger's eye. However, because I've been involved with birds, primarily my work with RSPB, I'm going to go through some of the issues over what's happening to the birds. So capercaillie, so they live most of the year on pine needles, and on the top right is a picture of some poo. And you clearly see is undigested pine needles. They also eat blaeberry as well, the berries and the leaves. And these little guys here, caterpillars, the moth caterpillars, are very important as food for the chicks. So some graphs to try and illustrate a point here. So the capercaillie has not done well recently. And one of the issues is rainfall. As you can see on the left-hand graph, the axis here is a measure of breeding success, the number of chicks per female produced. And this is rainfall on the bottom. So as rainfall increases, the number of chicks produced goes down. This is the line for Abernethy. This is the line for Craigmore, which is next door. So it wasn't so badly affected as Abernethy with rainfall, but nevertheless, once you get over about 80 to 100 millimeters of rainfall, you don't get many chicks. And the right-hand graph here shows what's happened to rainfall in June over time. So a lot of the dots from the 1930s and 20s are obtained from the Strathy. So the museum in Granton has got all the back copies of the Strathy newspaper, and the various keen weather watchers then they logged what they found in terms of temperature and rainfall. And you can see that the rainfall has increased over the 20th century, but a lot more of summers with heavy rainfall. So they only got 4 there, but scattered there. So that's a significant increase in how wet the climate's becoming for these birds and how that impacts their breeding success. This is a photograph of pine marten taken, well, it's caught in the act. So we had these video cameras set at capercaillie nests so we can look at the fate of the nest if they're lost. So we found that pine martens took about 1/3 of the capercaillie nests. So they're now a major predator of capercaillie nests. Prior to the 1990s, there was no pine martens in Abernethy. They only came in really after they were protected from the 1980s. They spread from Northwest Highlands and they're now throughout Scotland. So they are a major predator of various things. I'm going to digress from Abernethy Forest for a second and Culbin Forest. So there's keen ornithologists that have been studying crested tits from the 1970s in Culbin Forest. And what they found was about the 1990s, the breeding success collapsed. So I put cameras at these nests, and what we found was that pine martens were finding these, poking their paws through the holes and pulling out chicks and adults. So that's a picture of a chick there about to be consumed. So this left graph shows the daily predation rate through the 70s, 80s, 90s, and suddenly from the mid-90s it shoots up. And there's plenty of evidence too of bits of chicks and things found that point to pine martens being a problem. So a solution we worked on was to put an offset grid across the hole so that the tits can actually go through the grid and into the box, whereas the pine marten can't get its paw in. So in this nest box here, there was blue tits nesting, and they fledged successfully, and the pine marten was thwarted. Back to capercaillies. Now, another big problem that capercaillies have faced is fences. Fences are pretty ubiquitous now through the highlands, because we have so many deer, landowners and foresters want to protect young woodland by putting fences around them. So when RSPB bought Abernethy Forest, there were internal deer fences around planted areas. And we did a survey and we found that there was one capercaillie dying every month for each 4 kilometres of these deer fences. So the right-hand graph shows the counts we made on transects, showing the trends in the population over time. So that was what we observed on transects. These squares are modelled estimates of what would happen to the population based on what we knew about the production of chicks and the survival. So as you can see, we modelled quite well. These are the modelled values compared to observed. So we felt then we had a good understanding of the dynamics of population. So the triangles indicate what would happen if we hadn't removed the fences. In other words, if we hadn't removed this additional mortality caused by fences, this would show the track of the population. It would just start to dwindle away. So that was this information about 20 years old. So we've had this problem with, and clearly what we can do is just mark, make more visible. And we know that this makes a difference to the survival rate of the capercaillies. They see these fences and don't die at the same rate. Move on to crossbills now. It's one of the key things I worked on. Interestingly, there's these 3 types or species, depending on your view of taxonomy, which we can class as common, Scottish and parrot, with increasing bill sizes through this group. So common have the smallest bills, Scottish intermediate, and parrot have the big ones, big bills. And in general, they mate, all species mate in Abernethy, all types. And they'll mate with they'll mate with someone of their own type. So a common male mates with a common female, a parrot male with a parrot female, and so on. So they behave as species in that they don't interbreed. There has been the odd case of hybridization. And looking at the nest, we find that the parrots start first in late February. Scottish, the blues, they start, it's early March. So the commons don't start until mid-April. So there's a difference in the timing of these types. And that can be explained in terms of the availability of the seeds in the cones. So the bottom right graph shows Now, these were based on birds in captivity, a guy who breeds crossbills. And I was able to capitalize on this by asking him to give cones to his birds. For the parrot crossbills, they tend to damage cones a lot more than the Scottish crossbills. But over the size, as the cones get bigger, less and less damage is done to these cones. So it's much easier to break into a small cone than a big one. And it's easier for a parrot to break into a cone than a Scottish crossbill. Commons, they're just hopeless. They can't break into, I'm sorry, I'm talking about closed cones here. And this is an example on the left here of a cone that was closed and then has been attacked by a parrot crossbill. You can see that they can just chew the cones right up, whereas a common crossbill cannot do this. So what I reckon is happening is that as spring comes round and the birds are interested in breeding, the parrots can start breeding first because they can get into still closed cones. And then as cones just slightly open, Scottish crossbills start to capitalize them. And once the cones fully open in April, anything can get it, even tits can get at the seeds. And that's when the common crossbills breed. And then once all the seeds be shed by about June, all breeding stops. So on the right here, you can see that this is an open cone. So this is the sort of cone that a common crossbill can exploit. And that's the next cohort of cones green. So Scottish and parrot, they can start taking cones like this. They can start right in July when the cones are still green. And there's the next cohort, these little red things there. So you can see 3 cohorts of cones there. But the crossbills are only interested from here to here. The other graph I can mention here is the difference between Scots pine plantations and Caledonian pinewood. This axis here shows the size of the cones and length. Scots pine plantations all have cones about 40 millimeters in length. Whereas Caledonian pinewoods, as you get to these bigger trees here, you know, the granny pines, cones tend to get smaller. So big trees produce small cones. And of course, that's great for the crossbills. So that's kind of another reason why Caledonian pinewoods are important for crossbill species. Crest of tit, another of the iconic pinewood species. One of the key things they rely on is for nesting is soft sapwood in a pine tree. So they make excavations in the tree here for a nest cavity. Heartwood is hard, sapwood rots, and it becomes soft after about 10 years, and they can dig into it and make a nest. This shows you a transverse section through a dead pine. There's the heartwood, virtually untouched by fungus. Sapwood, rotten. So they need a reasonable size of tree which to make a nest. And you can see here on this graph, blue is what's available, yellow is what the crest tits are going into, and then woodpeckers, they could go in, they're really more interested in the largest trees. So with a large diameter at breast height. So here's a picture of a woodpecker which creates these holes in the larger of the dead trees. And then you get the secondary users like bees, swifts, and redstarts and tits. There's quite a host of species which are secondary users of these woodpecker holes. Deadwood is is one of the key habitats that Abernethy has in abundance, especially in the old forest. And it's so important for the biodiversity of woodland. In Sweden, they've counted the number of beetle species that are reliant on deadwood. It's probably about a third of all species of beetle rely on deadwood. Of course, in the past, when it was used by people more, the deadwood was harvested for firewood, with permission, of course. But now, of course, it's all left to lie. This tree I knew from 1999. I used to collect cones under it, and one day I noticed the leaves are all turning brown, and you see it's gradually disintegrating now. One of the big aims for Abernethy Forest is to expand the Caledonian pine wood, and it's been known for many years that both deer species, they limit the establishment of trees. So rather than using fences, which foresters use to control deer, the culling program was started, and it reduced the deer population, well, the red deer population, from about 12 deer per square kilometre to about 5. And then there was a noticeable increase in the establishment of trees over time. These are two photographs taken 1 in 75 of the same loch. And you can see in the foreground here, in 2016, these are all establishing trees. So over time, we expect this forest to expand back into, up the hill, so that we see a much bigger wooded landscape. Just to give you a slightly difficult to pick out the comparisons, the loch, because this is all sedges here now, which this is the area of sedges there. So that little peninsula there refers to that peninsula there. So that tree there is that tree there. I've always been impressed with how wooded Norway is. In many respects, they went through the same sort of process of being largely treeless in parts. This is up in northern Norway, where this woodland has been more or less as it is for many, many years. So this could be the sort of landscape we may see in the future, as it extends to our tree line here and also scrub line. But here's another example of what we might expect in time. So the only places where we've got very little woodland at the tree line at the minute, which does have quite a lot of juniper in it, but not much willow. So we'd expect, there's my phone going. You can see there's quite a lot of willow here growing, as well as juniper here. And here's a bird which occasionally breeds in Scotland, but I'm sure that we would get a lot more if we had more of this montane scrub. It's a thing called a blue throat. Very common in Norway, but almost absent here. So that's my talk on the history and the ecology of Abernethy Forest. If you're keen on learning more about what it's all about, I produced this book, which is available through the NHBS, and many of the photographs that you saw right at the beginning are illustrated in this book. It helps to illustrate the points made on various aspects of the forest. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ron. That was marvellous. I'm sure there might be one or two questions brewing.
Yeah, I'm happy to try and answer them.
Well, perhaps I'll start the ball rolling. As a pathologist now retired, I can't help myself but ask about tree pathology. And Can you tell why, for example, your tree that died in 1999, why it died? And are there any threats to the Caledonian pines? For example, a sort of equivalent to the Dutch elm disease or ash dieback. Are there any threats out there that might come our way?
It's not being a pathologist. So the usual story about old trees dying, because that clearly has not been blown over or broken its crown, it just died. But not long after it died, there was fruiting fungi came out the bark through the trunk. So fungi is certainly one thing that does kill trees, and insects is another if they defoliate trees, and the trees weaken, for example, they're more susceptible to insect damage. So those trees that are fire damaged are quite often, if they don't get their act together with filling wounds with resin, then they can be attacked by both fungi and insects. So that would be my guess for why these big old trees die. As regards what's happening now, so there's a disease called Dothystroma, or red band needle blight, and that's attacking mainly Corsican pines and lodgepole pines. And forestry and land solution has been to fell these trees. It's a fungus, and they reckon they can control it by removing the host. So they're trying to get rid of lodgepole pine, big style, and Corsican pine. But the stories got a bit more complicated because there seems to be different strains of this Dothystroma. So that, for example, there's one which lives on lodgepole pine, there's one that lives on Corsican pine, there's a strain that one lives on Scots pine. And clearly the Scots pine has been here for thousands of years. It's probably adapted or lives in harmony with its diseases in the same way you live in harmony with common cold. You know, it's a bit unpleasant at the time, but it doesn't kill us. The worry is if a lodgepole pine Dothystroma hybridizes with a Scots pine Dothystroma and becomes virulent, that could be a problem. So the geneticists are saying that as we try and respond to climate change, we should not introduce species that are closely related to our native species, because if they bring in diseases that they can cope with, and they start jumping species to a close related species like, you know, the rowan or whatever, one of our native species, it could be devastating for them.
That's not such happy news.
No.
So fungus, the bogeyman, might strike again.
Yeah, and of course the insects, they transmit it, like for Dutch elm disease.
Do we have any other questions? Or comments?
Just buy the book and then all your answers will be there.
Can I just give your book a plug? Because I reviewed your book for the Highland Naturalist, and it's an absolutely cracking book, and I would recommend it to anybody who's got any interest in Abernethy Forest whatsoever. It's a fascinating story of all the history and the wildlife and management and everything. So yeah, buy the book.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Where did you come across? Sorry. I was just wondering where you came across the beautiful watercolor paintings by the lady artists. Were they hanging in somebody's house, or it's such a valuable resource?
Yes. Now, the past owners of the upper part of Abernethy, known as the Forest Lodge section, was owned by the Naylor family. So they are descendants of Robert Holt, who was the first guy who leased Abernethy So through marriage, and the names changed. So they were the Nailers, and they bought the area, and they've had a long history of association with it. So in their archives, they've in their possession, they have these paintings of Anne Hope and also of Gertrude Martineau. So I had long discussions with them, and they were very kind enough to provide me with what they knew about the forest and material they had, like the game books, for example.
Fascinating. And the
They also
maps,
they had lots of paintings and of the area round about. I suggested that they should try and compile them as a book, but they never came up. They didn't bite that idea.
Thank you.
Good question, Mary. Anyone else?
Maria?
Yes, thank you very much. Really fascinating, and so much data coming out of the forest there. In one of your graphs, you showed that that the cone size was variable with the age of the trees, and that the older trees had smaller cones. Is that right? Did I get that right?
That's correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
What is the explanation for that?
I'm
naive. I don't know that much about trees, and
Yeah,
I can't figure out why an older tree would have smaller cones.
Yeah. So the older trees tend to have big crowns. So it's obviously a big energy investment to produce these cones and seeds, but that's how they reproduce. They need to do that. So an old tree, large tree, tends to have more buds on it, so it probably has a lot more. It has more cones which it's producing. Whereas a smaller tree, which has a smaller crown, has fewer buds, so it probably invests more in each cone, so it makes a bigger cone. So it's kind of it's how you invest your resources. If you're only going to put lots and lots of cones, then you just make them small to minimize your strain, because you also have to remember you've got to grow as well. So for some species, there's an inverse relationship between cone production and growth in the tree. So those years when you put lots and lots of cones, they put less into the timber of the tree. So it's all swings and roundabouts. Not sure if that explained it. There could be an advantage to producing a big cone, because it means that you're less likely to be eaten by the cone's less likely to be attacked by crossbill. Not a squirrel. Squirrels can get into these big cones as well. As easier than a crossbill.
Do you have a favourite bird of the forest, Ron?
Favorite, sorry?
Bird?
Favorite bird? Oh gosh. Well, I found the crossbill story the most interesting, because it was more challenging from trying to understand what was going on. So I was employed first to establish if the Scottish crossbill was a species and how to count them. And because the story was that Scottish crossbill lived in Caledonian pine woods, that's where I would catch some and measure some and record the calls, because the understanding the calls of the crossbills was a key to it. But when I started catching crossbills there, I caught mainly parrot crossbills, which were not supposed to be there. Also, I caught common crossbills, which are not supposed to be there either. There were all three birds in the mix. I was trying to understand that. And all three birds too all have distinct calls. So you can, that's probably the reason why they tend to pair like for like, because they are saying the same noises, the calls are the same. So yeah, so I would say the crossbills are my see commons and Scottish here. Up in, say, the Milbury forest. Both occur. Yeah.
Yeah.
So they overlap in the distributions, although common crossbills tend to be more associated with Sitka spruce and more in the west and south of Scotland, where the Scottish crossbills are more towards the east and associated with the pines, including lodgepole pines. They pretty like lodgepole pines. It's a cone that's opened slightly earlier than Scots pine. They then, and through the winter, they can exploit that quite easily because it opens early. And Sitka spruce, being a North American species, it starts opening in the autumn. It's thought that because the squirrels in North America, they do a lot of caching. They would strip cones off a tree and cache them, and that would prevent the tree from being allowed to shed its seed for its next generation. So the only way around that for the tree is to start shedding seed in the autumn. So Sitka spruce in September, October is already shedding seed. There's in a lull when the cones slightly close up when the wet weather, and in the spring there's another burst of seed shed. And that's when Norway spruce and Scots pine are shedding their seed in the spring. Because they've never had this behavior of the crossbills to strip trees, the squirrels to strip trees and cache the cones. And of course, shedding seeds in the spring is a much better strategy because you're then right at the start of the growing season, whereas shedding seed in the autumn, the seed has to lie on the ground. But the trees have obviously worked out in evolutionary terms that it's better to start shedding the seeds in autumn and risk what mice and voles can do to seed. But at least they've got the seed on the ground.
Nature wins every time.
Yeah.
Clever, very clever.
Clever trees.
Are there any more questions coming in, Audrey?
No, nothing on chat.
Okay, well, I will draw the meeting to a close. And thank you so much, Ron, for that wonderful talk. It's now brought us to the end of our winter programme, and we've learned about aliens, troublesome but fascinating lichens. We know all we need to know about ticks and Lyme disease. But I think you've hit the jackpot here with such a diverse talk on all the historical aspects of the forest, as well as those, perhaps not 3,500, but you've certainly whetted our appetite to get a hold of that book and identify so much more on the forest floor and beyond. So I can't thank you enough for that.
It's been a pleasure.